My name is Samuel Nayokpuk, and I have served as a tribal police officer for the native village of Chevak in western Alaska for 17 years. Before I tell you what happened between February 15th, 2024 and March 3rd of this year, before I explain why I can no longer look at the tundra the same way, I need you to understand something very clearly. If you're watching this while planning a trip to Alaska, if you're one of those adventure seekers who think the wilderness is just scenery waiting for your Instagram photos, you need to be cautious. What I'm about to say could save your life, or at least preserve your sanity. Before continuing, if you subscribe and like the video, you will be contributing greatly to the continuation of new stories to come. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Are you from Alaska? Have you ever stood on the tundra in February and felt the wind carry voices that aren't there? There is a 37-mile stretch of tundra between the villages of Chevak and Hooper Bay, roughly 60 miles southwest of Bethel, along the Bering Sea coast. The coordinates place it at approximately 61.5 degree N, 165.6 degree W. Though if you check your GPS out there, you'll find those numbers mean nothing. We call this area Nunarrluk in Yupik, which roughly translates to the pretend land, or the land that seems. The elders have a longer name for it, one that doesn't translate well, but essentially means the place where time forgets to move forward. Everyone has the right to know what is really going on in the area between mile marker 14 and mile marker 51 on the winter trail that connects our villages. This is the story that the Bureau of Indian Affairs would prefer stayed buried, that the Alaska State Troopers have known about since 1954, and that my own grandfather tried to warn me about 3 months before he died in 2019. What I am about to tell you goes against every value I have sworn to protect. After what happened in February and March, after learning that we lost 4 more people to the Nunarrluk, I can no longer remain silent. In my 17 years as a tribal police officer, I've responded to domestic violence calls in minus 60-degree weather, pulled snowmobilers from overflow ice, searched for missing children in whiteout conditions, and documented every kind of tragedy the tundra can inflict. I grew up in Chevak, learned to hunt and trap from my grandfather, earned my criminal justice degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and came back to serve my community with what I believed was a solid understanding of how the world works. I believed in evidence, in cause and effect, in the rational explanations that my college professors had taught me. My grandfather, Samuel Nayokpuk, was a traditional healer and storyteller, respected throughout the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta for his knowledge of the old ways. I loved him deeply, but I dismissed most of his warnings as superstition, the kind of stories that made sense before we had satellite phones and GPS units. I was wrong about everything. February 15th, 2024 started like any other winter day in Chevak. The temperature was minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that pushed it down to minus 60. The sun wouldn't rise until around 9:30 in the morning and would set again by 4:30 in the afternoon, giving us maybe 7 hours of weak, slanted light that barely seemed to touch the ground. I was in the tribal police office, a small prefab building next to the school, going through paperwork and monitoring the radio. My partner, Marcus Johnson, a white guy from Oregon who'd moved to Alaska for the adventure and somehow ended up working tribal police, was out on patrol, checking on some elders in the outlying areas of the village. The radio crackled around 10 a.m. It was Elena Aguchak, one of our village public safety officers, calling from Hooper Bay. Her voice had that particular quality I'd learned to recognize over the years, the sound of someone trying very hard to stay professional while something fundamental had shaken them. She reported that a hunter named David Tunachuk had left Hooper Bay 3 days earlier on February 12th, heading toward Chevak on his snowmobile to visit family. He should have arrived on the 13th at the latest. The trail between the villages was well marked, traveled regularly, and David was an experienced hunter who'd made the trip hundreds of times in his 43 years. He had a satellite phone, a GPS unit, emergency supplies, and knew the land better than most. He had not arrived in Chevak, had not answered his satellite phone, and his GPS beacon had gone dark approximately 28 miles from Hooper Bay. This was concerning but not unusual. GPS units fail, satellite phones die in the cold, snowmobiles break down. I told Elena we'd organize a search party and began making calls. By noon, we had 12 volunteers ready to head out, experienced hunters and mushers who knew the winter trail intimately. Marcus returned to the office, and I briefed him on the situation. He nodded, checked his gear, and we prepared to leave. Before we departed, I called my mother, as I always did before heading out onto the tundra in winter. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the radio playing in the background, broadcasting in Yupik from the Kiyuk station in Bethel. I told her about the search, and there was a long pause before she spoke. Her voice was quiet when she finally responded. She asked me where on the trail David had disappeared. I told her around mile marker 28, maybe closer to 30. Another pause. Then she said something I didn't understand at the time. She said that grandfather had told her to tell me something if I ever had to go out to the Nunarrluk. She said he'd made her promise, even though she didn't want to repeat his words because they scared her. I remember feeling impatient, wanting to get on the trail while we still had daylight. But I listened because you don't interrupt your mother when she's speaking about your grandfather's warnings. She said, "Your grandfather said, the tundra between the two villages is not like other land. He said it breathes. He said that during certain times, during the dark months especially, the land remembers what it used to be before humans came, before time settled into the pattern we understand. He said there are 147 people living in the Nunarrluk now, people who went missing over the last 70 years, people who didn't die, but changed. He said, if you ever have to go there, if you ever have to search for someone in that place, you need to understand 3 rules. First, do not follow voices, even if they sound like people you know. Second, do not trust your instruments after the sun sets. Third, if you see lights moving beneath the snow, turn around immediately and return the way you came, no matter who you're searching for. I remember thanking her, telling her I'd be careful, and feeling a mix of affection and frustration at these old stories. I understood they came from a time when the world was more mysterious, when people needed explanations for the inexplicable, but I had a missing person to find and daylight burning away. We left Chevak at 12:30 p.m., a convoy of 4 snowmobiles, each pulling a sled with emergency supplies. The sky was that peculiar winter white that makes it hard to distinguish land from air, everything blending into a monochromatic vastness that can disorient even experienced travelers. The temperature had risen slightly to -32, and the wind had died down to around 10 miles per hour, which meant relatively good traveling conditions. The winter trail between Chevak and Hooper Bay follows a traditional route that's been used for generations, marked now with wooden stakes every quarter mile, reflective tape catching what little light exists. The land out here is impossibly flat, tundra stretching in every direction without a single tree, without elevation change, just endless white broken, occasionally by frozen creeks and the dark shapes of willow shrubs barely poking through the snow. Marcus drove lead, following the GPS coordinates Elena had sent us for David's last known position. I was second in line, with 2 hunters from Chevak, Peter Nuneng, and Tommy Alexei behind me. We made good time, our headlights cutting through the pale afternoon dimness, breath freezing instantly in our wake. We reached mile marker 20 around 1:45 p.m., the sun already beginning its early descent toward the horizon. Everything was normal. The trail was clear. No sign of David or his snowmobile. No indication of any trouble. We continued on, and I remember feeling confident we'd find him broken down somewhere ahead, maybe embarrassed about the fuss, maybe with a dead battery or a thrown track. At mile marker 25, Tommy radioed ahead. His voice sounded strange, and he asked if anyone else noticed that the trail markers seemed off. I slowed down and looked at the marker we were passing. It read 25, which was correct. Tommy explained that wasn't what he meant, that the markers looked wrong somehow, like they were in the right places, but the distances between them felt different. Marcus told him it was probably just the flat light playing tricks, that the Arctic does that to your depth perception. We kept going. Mile marker 28 came up at 2:20 p.m. This was supposed to be close to David's last known GPS location. We stopped and fanned out, searching for any sign of him, any tracks leaving the trail, any indication of where he might have gone. The wind had picked up slightly, creating that particular whistling sound it makes across the flat tundra, and the temperature was dropping fast as the sun touched the horizon. We found nothing. No tracks, no disturbance in the snow, nothing to indicate David had ever passed this point. Marcus suggested we continue to mile marker 30, expand our search radius. We agreed and mounted up again. That's when I noticed my GPS unit was behaving strangely. The coordinates were fluctuating, changing by small amounts every few seconds, which didn't make sense because we were stationary. I mentioned this on the radio, and Marcus checked his unit. Same thing. Peter and Tommy reported the same fluctuations. Marcus said it was probably satellite interference, solar activity, something technical and explainable. We continued on. Between mile marker 28 and marker 30, something changed. I can't explain exactly what it was, but every single one of us felt it. The light seemed wrong, too bright for the position of the sun, which was now halfway below the horizon. The wind stopped completely, not gradually dying down, but stopping instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The air temperature, which my handlebar thermometer had been showing as -35, suddenly read -42, then -48, then -53, dropping 10 degrees or more in the span of maybe 30 seconds. But here's what made no sense. I didn't feel colder. The air felt warm against my face, almost pleasant, despite what the thermometer showed. Marcus stopped ahead of me, and I pulled up beside him. He was staring at his GPS unit, and even through his balaclava and goggles, I could see the confusion in his body language. He showed me the screen. The coordinates read 0.0 DGN, 00.0 DGW, Null Island, the middle of the ocean off the coast of Africa, where the prime meridian crosses the equator, the default error location for GPS units that have lost their signal. Except we could see satellites in the darkening sky, 4 or 5 of them moving across the twilight in their slow, deliberate paths. Peter and Tommy pulled up, and we all compared our GPS units, all showing Null Island, all showing impossible temperature readings, all showing our elevation as minus 147 feet, which would put us underground. That number, 147, stuck in my mind. My grandfather had mentioned it in his stories, though I couldn't remember the context. We decided to continue on foot, leaving the snowmobiles running for warmth and light. Marcus and I walked ahead, following the trail markers, while Peter and Tommy spread out to search the area. The sun had set completely now, and the darkness that falls on the Alaska tundra in February is absolute. Our headlamps created small circles of light that seemed to get swallowed by the black almost immediately. The snow beneath our feet crunched in that particular way it does at extreme cold temperatures, a high-pitched squeaking that should have been familiar, but it sounded wrong, delayed somehow, like the sound of our footsteps was arriving a half-second after we'd actually stepped. Marcus mentioned this, and I confirmed I'd noticed it too. We reached mile marker 30, which should have been 2 miles from where we'd left the snowmobiles, a walk of maybe 25 minutes. According to my watch, we'd been walking for 47 minutes. The marker itself looked strange. The wood was weathered in a way that didn't match the others, darkened and cracked, and the reflective tape was an older style, the kind they'd used maybe 20 or 30 years ago. The number 30 was hand-painted rather than stamped. Marcus ran his gloved hand over it and looked at me. Neither of us said anything, but we both knew this marker was old, much older than it should have been. The trail maintenance crews replaced these markers every few years. This one looked like it had been here for decades. I radioed back to Peter and Tommy, told them to return to the snowmobiles, that we were heading back as well. There was no response. I tried again. Static. I tried Marcus's radio. Static. We switched to different channels. Nothing but static, and not even normal static, but a strange rhythmic pattern, almost like breathing. Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, which should have worked regardless of radio problems. The screen lit up, showed full signal strength, but when he tried to make a call, nothing happened. The phone just displayed the connected symbol, but no sound, no ring, nothing. That's when we heard the voice. It came from somewhere ahead of us on the trail, from the direction of Hooper Bay, a man's voice calling for help in Yupik. The words were clear, despite the distance. Ikayukin, Ikayukin, Ayuken Ritua. Help me, I'm lost. Marcus looked at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. I remembered my mother's warning, my grandfather's first rule: do not follow voices. But this was why we were out here. Someone needed help. The voice called again, closer now, maybe 100 yards ahead. I made the decision that I regret and don't regret in equal measure. I told Marcus we needed to check it out, but carefully, and if anything seemed wrong, we'd return immediately to the snowmobiles. We walked forward, our headlamps cutting through the darkness, and the voice kept calling, staying roughly the same distance ahead of us, no matter how far we walked. After what felt like 10 minutes, I checked my watch. We'd been walking for 33 minutes. That wasn't possible. I could see the lights from our snowmobiles behind us, and they looked maybe 200 yards away, a distance we should have covered in a couple minutes. The voice stopped calling. The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no sound of snow settling, nothing. Then we saw the light. It was beneath the snow, maybe 20 feet ahead of us, a soft blue-green glow that pulsed gently, like bioluminescence in the ocean. It was beautiful. Marcus took a step toward it, and I grabbed his arm, remembering the third rule. If you see lights moving beneath the snow, turn around immediately. But the light wasn't moving. It was stationary, pulsing in place. That technicality seemed important at the time. We approached slowly, and as we got closer, I could see the light was coming from deeper than I'd initially thought. Maybe 10 or 15 feet beneath the surface of the snow and frozen ground. It illuminated the ice crystals in the snow above it, creating an area about 6 feet in diameter that glowed with that impossible underwater color. Marcus knelt down, and before I could stop him, he brushed away the surface snow. The glow intensified. Beneath the snow was ice, and beneath the ice, we could see something that made my mind struggle to process what my eyes were reporting. There was a man frozen in the ice, but not frozen the way bodies freeze. He was moving. Slowly, incrementally, but definitely moving. His mouth was opening and closing. His eyes were tracking back and forth. His fingers were flexing. The blue-green light was emanating from his skin, from inside him, and as we watched, he turned his head and looked directly at us. His eyes were that same blue-green color, glowing from within, and he smiled. Not a grimace of pain or a frozen expression, but a genuine smile of recognition and something else. Joy? Ecstasy? I don't have the words for what I saw in that expression. He raised one hand, slowly, gracefully, despite the ice surrounding him, and pointed past us, back toward the direction we'd come from. Marcus stood up quickly, stumbling backward, and I pulled him away from the glowing area. We ran back toward the snowmobiles, and the distance that had taken 33 minutes to walk, we covered in what felt like seconds. When we reached the machines, Peter and Tommy were there, but they looked wrong. Their faces were slack, expressionless, and they were standing perfectly still, staring out at the darkness. I called Peter's name. He didn't respond. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him, and his head turned toward me with a smoothness that was inhuman, mechanical. Then he blinked, and his expression returned to normal, and he looked confused and scared. He asked how long we'd been gone. I checked my watch. It read 3:17 a.m. That couldn't be right. We'd left Chevak at 12:30 p.m., reached this area around 2:30 p.m., and walked around for maybe an hour. It should have been around 4 or 4:30 p.m., early evening, but not the middle of the night. Tommy checked his watch and confirmed the time. 3:17 in the morning, February 16th. We'd lost nearly 13 hours. Marcus was shaking, whether from cold or fear I couldn't tell, and he kept saying that wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. We'd been walking for an hour at most. Peter asked what we'd seen, and I didn't know how to explain. I told them we needed to leave immediately, head back to Chevak, and figure out what was happening. We mounted the snowmobiles and started the drive back. The machines ran fine. The trail was clear. Everything seemed normal except for our instruments, which still showed impossible readings. We arrived back in Chevak at 4:45 a.m., having covered the 30 miles in just over an hour, which was about the right speed. When I walked into my house, my wife, Sarah, was sitting at the kitchen table crying. She grabbed me and held on like she thought I might disappear. And she told me I'd been missing for 15 hours, that the entire village had been out searching for us, that the Alaska State Troopers had been notified, and a search and rescue team was being assembled. I tried to explain that wasn't possible, that we'd only been gone for a few hours, but she showed me the clock, showed me her phone, showed me the messages she'd sent that had gone unanswered. Marcus, Peter, and Tommy were met by similar confusion and relief from their families. We went to the tribal office and tried to piece together what had happened. Our watches all showed different times, all wrong in different ways. Our GPS units were still malfunctioning. The footage from our helmet cameras, which we always wore on search and rescue missions, was corrupted, showing only static and occasional frames of images that didn't match our memories. One frame showed the four of us standing around the glowing area in the ice, but there were other figures with us, translucent shapes that looked human but weren't quite right, their proportions subtly wrong. We filed our reports, and I tried to write down what we'd experienced, but the words felt inadequate, unable to capture the strangeness of those lost hours. The next morning, I contacted Elena in Hooper Bay about David Nunarrluk. She told me something that made my blood run cold. David had arrived in Chevak on February 13th, exactly when he was supposed to. He'd spent 2 nights with his family and had returned to Hooper Bay on February 15th, the same day we'd gone looking for him, passing through the Nunarrluk around noon, hours before we'd received Elena's call reporting him missing. I asked her to repeat that, certain I'd misunderstood. She confirmed it. David was fine, had never been missing, had no idea why we were looking for him. I asked her about the radio call she'd made reporting him missing. There was a long pause. She said she'd made no such call, hadn't been on duty on February 15th, had been in Anchorage visiting her daughter. I checked our dispatch records. There was no record of a call from Elena, no record of us leaving on a search and rescue mission. According to our official logs, I'd worked a normal shift on February 15th, handled some paperwork, and gone home at 5 p.m. Marcus, Peter, and Tommy's timesheets showed the same routine day. But we all remembered those lost hours. We had the corrupted camera footage. We had the injuries, minor frostbite on Marcus's cheeks that hadn't been there before, a pulled muscle in my shoulder that I'd gotten while running back to the snowmobiles. I went to see my mother that evening. She was cooking akutak, Eskimo ice cream, and the house smelled like seal oil and berries. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything, all of it, holding nothing back. She listened without interrupting, her face growing more troubled as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, stirring the akutak, and then she went to her bedroom and returned with a green journal, old and worn, its pages yellowed and brittle. She said my grandfather had kept this journal for 40 years, had recorded everything he knew about the Nunarrluk, everything the elders had told him, everything he'd experienced himself. She'd never shown it to me before because grandfather had made her promise to only give it to me if I ever went into the Nunarrluk and came back changed. She said she could see the change in me, could see that I'd touched something out there that had touched me back. I took the journal home, and that night, while Sarah slept, I read it cover to cover, and with each page, my understanding of reality shifted in ways I still haven't fully processed. My grandfather's first entry was dated August 7th, 1984, though he noted this was a retroactive recording of events from 1954. He wrote in a mix of English and Yupik, his handwriting shaky in places, firm in others. He described being part of a military expedition in March 1954, Operation Willow Wind, a classified research project run by the Atomic Energy Commission that was ostensibly studying fallout patterns from nuclear tests in the Pacific, but was actually investigating what the military called temporal anomalies in remote Alaska. There had been reports from bush pilots, trappers, and indigenous hunters of missing time, visual distortions, and disappearances in certain areas of the tundra. The military wanted to understand if these phenomena were natural, if they could be weaponized, if they posed a threat to national security. My grandfather, young and serving as a guide and translator, had led a team of 12 scientists and soldiers into the Nunarrluk in March 1954. Only 5 of them came back. The rest, 147 people counting multiple expeditions over a 3-month period, disappeared into what the military eventually classified as Zone Anomaly Alpha 7, a designation that appeared in documents stamped with security classifications that shouldn't have existed for domestic research. My grandfather wrote that the Nunarrluk was what the old ones called a kavaktuak, a word that doesn't translate directly, but means something like a place where time softens, or where the ice of time melts. The elders believed that before humans came to Alaska, before even the animals we know today, the land existed in a state of constant flux, everything happening simultaneously. No clear distinction between past and future. All times coexisting like layers of ice in a pressure ridge. When humans arrived, when consciousness began observing and categorizing and creating linear narratives, time solidified, froze into the pattern we understand, one moment following another in sequence. But there were places, thin places, where this freezing never quite completed, where time remained soft and malleable. The Nunarrluk was one of these places, and it was particularly active during the dark months, when the sun's minimal presence meant less observation, less reinforcement of linear time. The glow we'd seen beneath the ice, the blue-green light, that was what grandfather called tuktnawa, the light of those who had chosen to step outside of time, who had released their attachment to linear existence and now existed in all moments simultaneously. The 147 people who disappeared weren't dead. They were expanded. They lived in the Nunarrluk, in a state beyond our normal understanding, experiencing past, present, and future as a single eternal now. When we'd heard the voice calling for help, it wasn't a trick or a trap. It was someone genuinely calling, someone who existed in 1987 or 2003 or 2019, or all of those times at once. And their call echoed through the soft time of the Nunarrluk into our present. When we'd lost 13 hours, we hadn't lost them. We'd experienced them differently, stretched them, or compressed them, or tangled them with hours from other times. The man frozen beneath the ice, moving and smiling. He was one of the expanded ones, and his smile had been recognition. He'd seen us in the way they see, had understood we were approaching the threshold of becoming what he'd already become. My grandfather wrote that 3 of his fellow expedition members had become expanded during Operation Willow Wind, had chosen or been chosen to step outside time, and they were still there in the Nunarrluk, still walking the tundra in March 1954 and March 1984 and March 2024 and every March in between and beyond. The journal contained interview transcripts, conversations my grandfather had recorded with elders who knew about the Nunarrluk. A woman named Mary Sundown, who'd lived to be 106 and died in 1989, told him that her grandfather had told her about the Chevak, about how in the very old days before Christian missionaries came, before the schools and the government, some people would deliberately choose to enter the soft time. Shamans, mostly, or people who'd lost too much and wanted to exist in a state where their loved ones were still alive, still present. She said the expanded ones weren't dangerous, weren't malevolent, but they did call out sometimes, lonely for the linear world they'd left behind. And you had to be careful not to answer, because their loneliness was strong enough to pull you in. Another elder, Paul Kigiak, who'd been a reindeer herder and guide, told my grandfather about seeing the lights beneath the ice in 1972 while traveling between Chevak and Hooper Bay. He'd been smart enough, or frightened enough, to turn back, but he'd heard his deceased wife's voice calling to him, had seen her standing on the trail ahead, looking exactly as she had on their wedding day in 1944. He knew it wasn't really her, or rather, it was her, but existing in all the times of her life at once. And if he'd gone to her, he would have become expanded too, would have joined her in that eternal simultaneity. The journal also contained official documents my grandfather had somehow obtained, photocopies of military reports, memos from the Atomic Energy Commission, and incident logs from the Alaska State Troopers. Operation Willow Wind's final report, dated July 1954, and classified under the Atomic Energy Act, concluded that Zone Anomaly Alpha 7 represented a naturally occurring space-time distortion of unknown origin and unknown mechanics, that it appeared to be stable and contained within a 37-mile area of tundra, and that the risks of further investigation outweighed potential military applications. The report recommended permanent monitoring, the establishment of informal warning protocols through local indigenous communities, and absolute secrecy regarding the nature of the anomaly. The military had made agreements with the tribal elders, had promised to respect the Chevak and keep outsiders away, and in exchange, the elders would maintain the traditional stories and warnings that had always protected their people. This had worked for decades, but as the old ones died, as the stories were dismissed as superstition by younger generations educated in Western schools, as GPS units and satellite phones gave people false confidence in their ability to navigate the tundra, the number of disappearances had slowly increased. My grandfather's list of the expanded ones went from 73 in 1954 to 98 in 1984 to 147 in 2023, the last entry he'd made before his death. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to convince myself that what I'd read was metaphorical, that my grandfather had been trying to preserve traditional stories and had framed them in modern language, that there had to be rational explanations for everything. But I couldn't explain the lost hours. I couldn't explain the man moving beneath the ice. I couldn't explain the corrupted footage that showed impossible figures standing with us. Marcus was having nightmares, waking up screaming about drowning in frozen light. Peter had developed a nervous tic, constantly checking his watch as if afraid time might slip away from him again. Tommy had requested a transfer to Bethel, wanted to get away from Chevak and the tundra, though he wouldn't say why. I tried to talk to the tribal council about what had happened, about my grandfather's journal, about the need to establish better warning systems for anyone traveling the winter trail. They listened politely and thanked me for my service, and I could see in their eyes that the younger council members thought I'd suffered some kind of breakdown, while the two oldest members, both in their 70s, looked at me with a sadness and understanding that confirmed they knew exactly what I was talking about. On March 3rd, 2024, I received a call from the Alaska State Troopers, a sergeant named Michael Reese, calling from Bethel. He asked if I could come to the regional headquarters for a meeting regarding an incident on the winter trail. I drove up from Chevak, a journey of about 60 miles that took 3 hours across the snow and ice, and met with Sergeant Reese in a small conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork. He was in his 50s, weathered face, tired eyes, and he sat across from me with a thick file folder marked with classifications I recognized from my grandfather's journal. He asked me what I knew about the Nunarrluk. I told him everything, showing him my grandfather's journal, walking him through our experience on February 15th. He listened, made notes, and when I finished, he opened the file folder and showed me documents that made everything real in a way that terrified me more than the glowing man beneath the ice. The Alaska State Troopers had been maintaining an unofficial log of incidents in what they officially designated as Sector 7 since 1957. Every disappearance, every report of missing time, every strange occurrence was documented in these files, though never in official reports, never in ways that would attract attention from outside investigators or journalists. Sergeant Reese explained that he was part of a very small group within the state troopers, maybe 15 officers total across Alaska, who were aware of what he called the soft zones, areas where space-time behaved abnormally. The Nunarrluk was one of 7 such zones in Alaska, though it was the most active and the most dangerous. The troopers' job wasn't to investigate these zones or try to contain them, but simply to monitor them, document incidents, and maintain relationships with indigenous communities who'd been managing them for thousands of years. He said my grandfather had been one of their primary contacts in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, had helped them understand what was happening, had saved countless lives by maintaining the traditional warnings and stories. Sergeant Reese showed me a photograph from 1991, taken with a telephoto lens from about half a mile away from the Nunarrluk. It showed what looked like a group of people standing on the tundra, maybe 20 or 30 figures, all perfectly still, all glowing with that same blue-green light I'd seen. Some of them were wearing modern parkas. Some were dressed in traditional caribou skin clothing from a century ago. Some were in military uniforms from the 1950s, and some were naked, their skin that impossible luminescent blue-green. They weren't standing in any particular pattern, just scattered across the snow, and the photo had a strange quality, a blurriness that didn't seem like camera shake, but rather like the figures themselves were vibrating between states of existence. Reese said this gathering happened occasionally, usually during the winter solstice or the equinoxes, times when the balance between light and dark was shifting. The expanded ones would manifest more fully during these periods, would become more visible to linear observers. He said the indigenous communities had always known to avoid the Nunarrluk during these times, and that was why the traditional calendar had certain days marked as taboo for traveling. Days that aligned perfectly with when the soft time was most active. I asked him why he was telling me all of this, why he was showing me classified documents and admitting to decades of cover-up. He said it was because I'd been touched by the Nunarrluk, because I'd stood at the threshold and come back, and that meant I had a choice to make. He said every few generations, someone from the indigenous communities who lived near a soft zone would become what he called a bridge, someone who existed partially in linear time and partially in expanded time, someone who could communicate with the expanded ones and help maintain the boundaries that kept the zones from growing. My grandfather had been a bridge. The elders who'd spoken to him about the Kavak had been bridges. And now, after my experience on February 15th, I was becoming a bridge, whether I wanted to or not. He said I could try to ignore it, try to go back to my normal life and pretend nothing had changed, but the signs would continue, the experiences would intensify, and eventually I'd have to either accept the role or risk becoming fully expanded myself. I asked him what being a bridge meant practically. He explained that bridges could perceive the soft time in ways normal people couldn't, could see the expanded ones when they manifested, could sometimes communicate with them, and help them when they were trying to reach out to the linear world. Bridges also served as anchors, their presence helping to stabilize the boundaries between linear and expanded time, preventing the soft zones from spreading. It was a form of service, a duty that had been performed for thousands of years, but it came with costs. Bridges age differently, their bodies existing partially outside normal time, which meant they might live much longer than normal, but also meant they experienced time in ways that could be disorienting and isolating. Bridges couldn't form deep relationships with normal people because the temporal asynchrony eventually became too pronounced. Bridges often had to make hard choices about who to help and who to let go, about whether to pull someone back from the threshold or let them cross over into expanded existence. My grandfather had done this for 40 years, had carried the weight of those choices, had maintained the boundaries while watching people he loved slip into the soft time. I left the meeting feeling like I was walking through a dream, like the world around me was slightly unreal. I drove back to Chevak, and during that drive, I started noticing things I'd never seen before. The snow beside the road had patterns in it, not just the random drifts created by wind, but organized structures, geometries that repeated and changed and seemed to pulse with meaning. The sky had textures I'd never perceived, layers of light and dark that weren't clouds or atmospheric phenomena, but something else, something my eyes could suddenly see, but my brain struggled to interpret. When I got home, Sarah took one look at me and started crying. She said my eyes were different, that they reflected light strangely, like there was a faint glow deep inside them. I looked in the mirror and saw what she meant. In dim light, if I looked closely, there was a very faint blue-green luminescence in my pupils, barely visible, but definitely there. I'd crossed a threshold I hadn't known existed, and there was no going back. Over the next month, the changes intensified. I started perceiving what Sergeant Reese had called temporal echoes, moments from the past bleeding through into my present perception. I'd be walking through Chevak and suddenly see the village as it had been 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or before it existed at all, just empty tundra and the sound of wind. These visions lasted only seconds, but they were absolutely real, not imagination or hallucination, but genuine perception of other times layered over the present. I started hearing voices, not constantly, but often enough to be disturbing. Voices of people who'd become expanded, calling out from the Nunarrluk. Some of them I recognized from my grandfather's journal, names and dates that matched people who disappeared decades ago. Some were recent, people who'd been reported missing in the last few years. They weren't asking for rescue. They were saying goodbye, or hello, or simply acknowledging my presence as a bridge. A woman named Agnes Paul, who disappeared in 1998 while traveling to visit her sister, spoke to me one night while I was lying in bed. Her voice was clear, as if she was standing next to me, and she said, "Tell my sister I'm happy here. Tell her I see everything, all the moments of her life, and she's beautiful in all of them. Tell her the land holds me gently." I delivered the message to Agnes's sister Mary, who was in her 70s and still lived in Chevak. I didn't know what her reaction would be, didn't know if this would bring her comfort or terror. She listened to me repeat Agnes's words, and tears ran down her face, but she was smiling. She said she'd always known Agnes had become one of the Tukut Nawa, had always felt her presence in the quiet moments. She thanked me for confirming it, for giving her Agnes's words, and she said if I was becoming a bridge like my grandfather, the community would need me to help them understand what was happening to their loved ones who'd been taken by the soft time. I started serving in this capacity, mediating between the linear world of Chevak and the expanded existence of the Nunarrluk, carrying messages and providing closure to families who'd lost people to the Kavaktuak. It was painful work, emotionally exhausting, but it felt right in a way that my police work never had. I was protecting my community not from crime or danger, but from the existential loneliness of not knowing, from the torment of uncertainty. In April 2024, I had my first direct confrontation with the necessity of making a choice about someone at the threshold. A teenage boy from Chevak, 16 years old, named Andrew Chanar, went missing while out hunting ptarmigan with friends. His friends reported he'd walked over a small rise and simply vanished, there one moment and gone the next, his tracks ending abruptly in the snow. This was about 5 miles from the edge of the Nunarrluk, close enough that I immediately suspected what had happened. I organized a search party, but before we could leave, I had a vision so vivid and overwhelming that it dropped me to my knees in the tribal office. I saw Andrew standing in the soft time, halfway between linear and expanded existence, his body flickering like a failing light bulb, and I could feel his terror and his wonder, both equally intense. He was at the exact moment of choice, the point where he could either return to linear time or let go and become expanded. I could feel that he wanted to come back, wanted to return to his family and friends and the life he knew. But I could also feel the pull of the expanded state, the seductive promise of existing in all moments simultaneously, of never losing anyone because everyone you loved would always be present in some time you could access. I drove out toward the Nunarrluk alone, against every protocol and against Sergeant Reese's advice when I called him. I stopped at the edge of the zone, where the trail markers started showing impossible numbers and the GPS began registering null island coordinates. I got off my snowmobile and walked forward on foot, and the world around me began to shimmer and shift, multiple times overlaying each other like double-exposed photographs. I saw the tundra in summer and winter simultaneously, saw caribou herds that hadn't migrated through this area in decades, saw hunting camps from centuries ago and satellite dishes from next year. I called Andrew's name, and my voice echoed strangely, arriving before and after I spoke, creating a chorus of my own words. I saw him then, about 100 yards ahead, standing perfectly still, his body translucent and glowing faintly. I walked toward him, and distance lost all meaning. Every step I took brought me closer and farther simultaneously, and I understood this was what it meant to exist in soft time, to experience space as negotiable as time, all positions coexisting. When I finally reached Andrew, he looked at me with eyes that held an ancient understanding no 16-year-old should possess. He spoke, and his voice came from multiple time periods at once, child and teenager, an old man, all talking in unison. He said he could see everything from here, could see his own life from birth to death and beyond, could see his family's history stretching back generations and forward into futures that hadn't happened yet. He said it was beautiful and terrifying, and he didn't know if he wanted to give it up, to return to the limited linear perception he'd had before. I asked him what his family would choose if they could decide for him. He was quiet for a moment that might have been hours in linear time, and then he said they'd want him to come home, but they'd also want him to be happy, to choose what felt right for his soul. I told him that once he became fully expanded, there was no returning to linear existence, that he'd lose the ability to interact with the normal world in any meaningful way, that his family would grieve him as dead even though he'd still exist. I told him that being a bridge like I was becoming might be possible for him, that he could exist in both states, but it was a hard path, lonely and strange and demanding. He asked me what I would choose. I realized I didn't know. Part of me was terrified of what I was becoming, of the isolation and the burden of mediating between worlds. But another part of me, growing stronger every day, was drawn to the expanded state, to the promise of existing beyond the cruel linearity of time, beyond loss and regret, and the forward march toward death. I told Andrew, honestly, that I didn't know what I'd choose if given a clear option, but that I'd accepted the bridge state because my community needed me, because my grandfather had left me a legacy of service that I couldn't abandon. Andrew nodded, and I watched as he made his decision, watched as his translucent form solidified slightly and the glow in his eyes dimmed. He chose to return to linear time, chose family and friends, and the limited but immediate pleasures of normal existence. I took his hand, and the touch connected us in a way that let me pull him back across the threshold. And we walked together out of the soft time and back to the snowmobile. The entire encounter had felt like it lasted hours. But when we returned to Chevak, only 45 minutes had passed since I'd left. Andrew's family welcomed him back with tears and joy, and he told them he didn't remember much of what had happened, just getting lost and being found. I didn't contradict him, understood that protecting people from the full truth was sometimes its own form of service. Since then, I've been called to the Nunarrluk 8 more times. 8 more people standing at the threshold, needing help deciding whether to return or cross over. 3 of them chose to return. 5 of them chose to become expanded, to let go of linear time and exist in the eternal simultaneity of the Kavaktuak. Each time someone chose expansion, I felt the choice resonate through my own being, felt the pull toward that same state grow stronger. My eyes now glow visibly in darkness, that blue-green light that marks me as a bridge. My body ages slowly, imperceptibly, and Sarah has noticed I look the same at 42 as I did at 35. She's aging normally, and the gap between us grows more apparent each year, a visible marker of my increasing separation from normal human time. We've stopped talking about the future, about growing old together, about grandchildren, because we both know my future doesn't follow the same trajectory as hers. She's been patient and loving and terrified, and I can see the moment approaching when I'll have to choose between maintaining my connection to her and fully embracing my role as a bridge. The more deeply I connect with the soft time, the less I can relate to linear existence, and the relationships that once anchored me are becoming gossamer threads that might snap with the slightest strain. My grandfather's journal has become my guide and my warning. He wrote about this same progression, about losing his wife to old age while he remained middle-aged, about watching his children grow elderly while he stayed frozen in time like the figures beneath the ice. He wrote about the isolation, about being unable to explain to anyone outside the small community of bridges and elders what his existence had become. But he also wrote about the purpose, about the people he'd helped, about the boundaries he'd maintained, about the soft zones he'd kept from expanding and consuming more of the linear world. He'd seen himself as a guardian, standing at the threshold between realities, and he'd accepted the cost because someone had to pay it. I'm beginning to understand his choice, to feel the weight of that same responsibility settling onto my shoulders. The Alaska State Troopers have officially designated me as the primary contact for Sector 7, have given me access to their classified files, and included me in their network of bridges and monitors who maintain awareness of all the soft zones across Alaska. There are 47 of us currently active, people who exist between linear and expanded time, who serve as mediators and guardians and witnesses to the reality behind reality. The military has also made contact, a Department of Homeland Security division that officially doesn't exist, the Anomalous Events Directorate, though they use a dozen different cover names depending on the situation. They've offered me resources, salary, official status, all in exchange for detailed reports and cooperation with their ongoing monitoring and research. I've declined their offers, understanding, as my grandfather did, that the soft zones aren't problems to be solved or resources to be exploited, but fundamental aspects of reality that require respect and maintenance, not conquest or control. The old ways understood this. The indigenous knowledge that the military had tried to catalog and weaponize in 1954 was never about controlling the soft time, but about coexisting with it, about recognizing that reality is more complex and stranger than the linear materialism of modern civilization can acknowledge. The 147 expanded ones living in the Nunarrluk aren't victims or threats. They're people who've chosen or been chosen to experience existence differently, and they're as valid and real as anyone walking the streets of Chevak or Bethel or Anchorage. I've started keeping my own journal, continuing my grandfather's work, documenting every experience and every encounter with the soft time. I write for whoever comes after me, whoever becomes the next bridge when I finally make my own choice between maintaining my liminal existence or stepping fully into the expanded state. I write for my community so they'll understand what happens to their loved ones who disappear into the tundra, so they'll know that disappearance isn't death, but transformation, continuation in a different mode of being. I write for myself, trying to make sense of perceptions and experiences that have no vocabulary in normal language, trying to preserve my linear identity even as it dissolves into something larger and stranger. Time isn't a line. Time isn't a line. Time isn't a line. This is the truth I've learned, the fundamental realization that changes everything. We experience time as a line because our consciousness creates that perception, freezes the fluid reality into a solid narrative we can navigate. But that freezing is an act of observation, not an inherent quality of existence. In the Nunarrluk, where observation is less consistent, where the long dark months mean less human attention and awareness, time softens back into its natural state, all moments coexisting, past and future as accessible as present. The people we call missing aren't lost. They're just lost to us, existing in a time state we can't normally perceive. When I stand at the edge of the Nunarrluk now, I can see them, all 153 of them as of last count, walking the tundra in their various eras, wearing clothes from different decades, existing as they were at different ages, sometimes young and sometimes old, all versions present simultaneously. I can see my grandfather among them, though he died in 2019 in linear time. His body is buried in the cemetery in Chevak, but his consciousness exists in the expanded state, walking the soft time as both the young guide from 1954 and the old healer from 2019, in every age between and beyond. He sees me when I visit the edge of the zone, and he smiles with the same expression I saw on the man frozen beneath the ice. Joy and recognition, and an understanding that transcends words. He's tried to communicate with me, his voice coming through in fragments, in sensations rather than language. But I can feel his approval, his support, his acceptance of my choice to become a bridge. Last week, I received a call from Elena Aguchak in Hooper Bay, the real Elena this time, not the phantom voice that had lured us into the Nunarrluk on February 15th. A tourist couple from Germany had disappeared while snowmobiling between the villages, had last been seen around mile marker 25, right in the heart of the soft zone. I organized a search party, but I already knew we wouldn't find them. Or rather, we'd find them, but they'd be standing at the threshold, experiencing the same moment of choice that Andrew and others had faced. When we reached mile marker 25, I left the others behind and walked forward alone into the soft time. And I saw the couple standing hand in hand, their bodies translucent and glowing, their faces showing wonder rather than fear. I approached them, prepared to offer them the same choice I'd offered Andrew. But before I could speak, the woman turned to me and said in perfect English that they'd been searching for this, that they'd read about the Nunarrluk in obscure forums online, in conspiracy theories and suppressed documents, and they'd come to Alaska specifically to find it, to step outside linear time together. They'd lost a child 3 years ago, a daughter who'd drowned, and the pain of living in a time where she no longer existed was unbearable. In the expanded state, she would exist always, and they could be with her in the moments of her life, could experience her presence eternally rather than mourning her absence temporally. I asked them if they understood they could never return, that their families would grieve them, that they'd be officially listed as dead. They said they understood and accepted it, that the cost of staying in linear time was higher than the cost of leaving it. I watched them make their choice, watched them let go of their attachments to linear existence, and I felt it when they crossed over fully, felt the moment they became expanded ones, their consciousness spreading across all the times and places they'd ever been or would ever be. They walked away hand in hand into the white eternity of the Nunarrluk, and I returned to the search party and told them we'd found no trace of the couple. that they'd likely perished in a crevasse or been caught in a sudden weather event. The standard explanations we use for disappearances that can't be explained through normal means. The official report will list them as presumed dead, and their families in Germany will mourn them, never knowing they chose transformation over death, expansion over limitation, eternal simultaneity over linear progression toward ending. I understand their choice more each day. The burden of living in linear time, of experiencing loss as permanent and past as irretrievable, grows heavier as my perception of the soft time deepens. I can now see the edges of the Nunarrluk, even from Chevak, can perceive the shimmer in the air that marks where linear time begins to soften, can hear the voices of the expanded ones calling across the years. My connection to Sarah has become tenuous, our conversations feeling like they're happening across a vast distance even when we're sitting next to each other. She's aging, changing, moving forward through time in the inexorable way linear beings do, while I'm becoming unstuck, experiencing moments out of sequence, remembering things that haven't happened yet, and forgetting things that have. Last night, I saw her as she'll be at 70, gray-haired and beautiful, sitting in the same chair she occupies now at 45. And the two images overlaid each other, present and future, existing simultaneously in my perception. She couldn't see what I was seeing, couldn't understand when I tried to explain, and the loneliness of being a bridge became overwhelming in that moment. I know I'm approaching my own threshold, my own moment of choice. I can continue as I am, serving as a bridge, but losing more of my linear existence each year, eventually becoming so detached from normal time that I'm functionally expanded while still trying to maintain the illusion of linear life. Or I can make the choice the German couple made, the choice that 5 of the 8 people I've encountered at the threshold made, the choice that my grandfather made when his body finally gave out in 2019, and he let his consciousness slip fully into the soft time rather than ending completely. The elders tell me there's no shame in either choice, that bridges have always, eventually either returned fully to linear time, though diminished and damaged by their years in the liminal state, or crossed over into expanded existence when the burden became too great. They tell me I've served my community well, have helped families find closure, have maintained the boundaries as my grandfather did. And if I choose to step into the Nunarrluk permanently, another bridge will emerge to take my place because the soft zones always call forth the guardians they need. I'm writing this now, in March 2025, almost exactly 1 year after my first encounter with the soft time, because I want there to be a record of what I've experienced, what I've learned, what I've become. If you're watching this video, if you're considering traveling to Western Alaska, to the tundra between Chevak and Hooper Bay, you need to understand what you're approaching. The Nunarrluk isn't a place on a map. It's a state of existence, a way of being that's as valid and real as the linear time you currently inhabit. The 153 people existing in the soft time aren't ghosts or victims. They're expanded consciousnesses experiencing all time simultaneously, living in an eternal now that encompasses past, present, and future. They're happy there, most of them, having chosen transformation over limitation, having accepted that existence is stranger and more beautiful than the narrow slice of it we perceive in normal linear consciousness. If you go into the Nunarrluk, if you hear voices calling, or see lights beneath the ice, or lose track of time You're standing at a threshold. You can turn back, return to linear existence, maintain your limited but immediate connection to the world you know. Or you can step forward, let go of your attachment to sequential time, and join those who've expanded beyond the constraints of linear being. Neither choice is wrong. Both have costs and gifts. I've decided to make my choice on the spring equinox, March 20th, 2025, when the balance between light and dark is perfect, when the soft time is most accessible. I don't know yet which choice I'll make. Part of me wants to stay, to continue serving as a bridge, to maintain my connection to Sarah and my community, and the linear world I've known for 42 years. Part of me wants to step into the expanded state, to exist in all times simultaneously, to join my grandfather and the 153 others walking the eternal tundra, to experience Sarah as she is at every age, present and past and future, rather than losing her incrementally to the forward march of time. Whatever I choose, I wanted this record to exist, this explanation of what the Nunarrluk is and what it means to become a bridge or become expanded. The government won't tell you this truth. The Alaska State Troopers will continue to list disappearances as presumed deaths. The military will maintain their classifications and their monitoring. But you deserve to know that the missing aren't always dead, that transformation is possible, that time isn't the rigid line we've been taught to believe it is. Reality is negotiable. The old ways knew this. The land remembers this. And in places like the Nunarrluk, the memory is strong enough to soften the frozen time back into its natural fluid state. If you're from Alaska, if you live in or near the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, you probably know someone who's disappeared into the tundra, someone who went out hunting or traveling and never came back. I want you to know they might still be there, existing in the soft time, happy and expanded, and experiencing existence in ways we can't imagine from our linear perspective. If you've lost someone to the Nunarrluk, if you want to know if they're among the expanded ones, I can try to find out for you. I can walk to the edge of the zone, can call their name into the soft time, can listen for their response. I can't bring them back, can't pull them out of expanded existence once they've fully crossed over, but I can carry messages, can provide closure, can confirm that they still exist, even if not in the form or time you knew them in. This is the service I've provided for the past year, and I'll continue to provide it for as long as I remain in linear time, however long that might be. To those watching from outside Alaska, to those who think this is just another ghost story or conspiracy theory, I challenge you to research Operation Willow Wind, to look for the gaps in the historical record, to notice the patterns in missing persons cases across remote Alaska. You'll find that certain areas have disappearance rates far exceeding statistical norms, that searches in these areas often end without finding bodies or evidence, that locals avoid these places during certain times of year. You'll find references in military documents to research projects that officially don't exist, to classified zones that aren't marked on any map, to temporal anomalies that scientists can't explain. You'll find the truth if you look carefully enough, though you might wish you hadn't once you understand what it means. The world is stranger than we pretend it is. Reality is more flexible than science acknowledges. And in the remote places, in the thin places where human observation has been minimal and indigenous wisdom has been maintained, the truth bleeds through. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to be cautious, to respect the warnings of indigenous communities, to understand that when elders tell you not to travel certain places at certain times, they're not speaking from superstition, but from thousands of years of experience with phenomena that modern science hasn't yet figured out how to categorize or measure. The Nunarrluk is real. The soft time is real. The expanded ones are real. And if you're ever traveling across the Alaska tundra and your GPS suddenly shows impossible coordinates, if your watch starts showing different times simultaneously, if you hear voices calling in the wind or see lights beneath the ice, you're standing at a threshold. You can turn back, or you can step forward, but know that the choice, once made, is final. The land remembers everything. The Nunarrluk holds everyone who's ever chosen to enter it. And time, for those who understand its true nature, isn't a line but a web. All moments interconnected, all times accessible to those willing to let go of their linear attachment. My name is Samuel Nayokpuk, and I am, for now, still a tribal police officer in Chevak, Alaska, though I'm also something more and something less than what I was a year ago. I'm a bridge between worlds, a guardian of thresholds, a mediator between linear and expanded time. In 6 days, I'll make my final choice. We'll either recommit to linear existence despite its limitations, or step fully into the soft time and join the 153 who've gone before me. Whatever I choose, I wanted you to know the truth about the Nunarrluk, about the Kavaktwak, about the places where time softens and reality becomes negotiable. The world is full of these places, these thin spots, where the observations that hold reality in its familiar form are weak enough that older, stranger states of being can manifest. You've probably walked past them without noticing, felt the slight disorientation, the sense that something is off, the moment where time seems to hesitate. Most people dismiss these moments, retreat into the comfort of linear perception, and that's fine. That's safe. But for those of you who feel the pull, who've always suspected that reality is more complex than you've been taught, who've experienced moments that don't fit into the standard narrative, I want you to know you're not crazy. You're just seeing past the frozen surface to the fluid truth beneath. Time isn't a line, it's a web, and we're all caught in it together. Past and present and future, all existing simultaneously, all accessible if we're willing to let go of our attachment to sequential perception. Welcome to Alaska. Welcome to the tundra. Welcome to the places where the old truth still holds power, where transformation is possible, where disappearance doesn't mean ending, but expansion. Be careful out there. Or don't. The choice, as always, is yours.